So you have found your way into the University Lowbrow Astronomers, in this case, the March edition. I can't believe it's March already, but it is. And it seems like I was just doing the same thing yesterday, I swear. But anyway, I'm Charlie Nielsen, the club president. Seems like I have been forever. Someday that will change. But we also have a few other club officers probably on Zoom and in the room. We'll get some reports from them later on. But as tradition would have it, we always have our guest speaker first. In the event that somebody was here for that and didn't want to stick around for our really engaging business meeting, we might let them escape. So anyway, our special guest tonight is Richard J. Goodrich, PhD, University of St. Andrews. And he is an author, photographer, and a historian. After 20 years as a history professor in Britain and the United States, Richard resigned his teaching post to pursue a full-time writing career. His interests range from ancient history, the Roman Empire, and early church history, to the modern age. He publishes two newsletters. One is a weekly bulletin and the other one monthly. And he also published the book Comet Madness, How the 1910 Return of Halley's Comet Almost Destroyed Civilization. This book examines the terror generated by the comet's return and the Earth's passage through its tail. Comet Madness is a fascinating story of how people respond to a potential astronomical crisis and how unscrupulous agents, the media, religious leaders, quack scientists, and other charlatans exploit public gullibility to generate profits. It's interesting to note that Richard is speaking to us currently from Taiwan, a full 12 hours away from us, and I think probably the furthest that we've reached out yet. So I think it's actually appropriate to not only welcome Dr. Richard Goodrich, but say good morning. Thank you.
Good morning, and lovely to be here virtually, as it were. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about fear and madness and what happens when the unexpected and potentially unexplained takes place. And I want to begin tonight's talk with two quotes. This is an old German school children's rhyme. I should say before I get going, is everything working fine? Everybody can see the screen?
Yeah, we're looking good.
Okay, good. So this is an old German school children's rhyme. If you grew up in Germany in the 18th, 19th century, you would know this rhyme. And it represents a bit of conventional wisdom about what you can expect when a comet appears in the sky. 8 things a comet always brings: wind, famine, plague, and death to kings. War, earthquakes, floods, and dire things. So these are the things that are to be expected, and it represents, I suppose, a distillation of human knowledge over human history. Excuse me. This quote might be a bit more familiar to us. I saw and behold a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. So this is from the book of Revelation 6:8. And it was a, excuse me, I'm getting clogging up here for a moment. It was a very conventional piece of wisdom that you would find often rolled out in a pastor's talks whenever a comet appeared in the skies in kind of the early period, if we will. So let's talk a little bit about rationality. And I am by training an ancient historian and a classicist. And one of the things that happens when you get a PhD in history is you have to take a solemn vow, and that is, whenever you give a presentation, no matter what the topic, even something like 20th century astronomy, you have to work in some sort of classical reference. And as you can see, I've succeeded tonight. Here we have Socrates on the left and the Roman god Bacchus on the right. Exemplars of two different poles in the human experience. So Socrates is the reasoning mind, perhaps the most rational of men in history, and of course Bacchus is the god of wine and spirits and the sorts of behaviors that come from overindulgence in wine. So the question I want to begin with tonight is, are human beings rational? Are we fundamentally rational, or are we just we put a little polish on our base sort of animalistic emotional drives? In 1910, April of 1910, the Pittsburgh Post ran a point-counterpoint article that featured two prominent city theologians, Reverend Rudolph Coffey and Reverend Albert Diefenbach. What they were going to discuss was the question of, are humans rational or not? Reverend Coffey was given the task of defending human rationality, and Reverend Diefenbach went on the other side and said basically, no, irrationality still rules our lives. So to make this an interesting sort of discussion, the newspaper posed a question or a theoretical situation, which was, if a comet was about to strike the Earth, would humans react rationally, or would they revert to their common nature and behave completely irrationally? Reverend Coffey was given the unenviable task of defending rationality, and he began with a very positive statement. And his view was that we had, over the generations, over the millennia, evolved and become extremely rational. We were the children of Socrates, in other words. And if we were in this situation, we would react as Socrates had reacted. So if you remember the great scene in Plato's Apology where Socrates has received his death sentence, and he goes and he reclines on the couch, drinks his hemlock, and then calmly has a final discussion with his disciples. That is what we would be like if we knew we were all going to die in a matter of weeks or months. Not only that, it might be a good thing for humanity. And so Coffey proposed the idea that it would kind of stimulate a turning back to religion, a return to God, if you will. Churches would fill, people's minds would turn from, sort of the day-to-day mundane things that occupy our thoughts, and we would start to contemplate the eternal, get our lives in order, and prepare very calmly, like Socrates, to meet our end. Well, Reverend Diefenbach had a very different view of this. His view was this was complete nonsense, and if humans knew they were about to be wiped out by a killer comet, anarchy would quickly reign. So human society would rapidly dissolve, break down. The strong would take advantage of the weak and make one last Epicurean bacchanalia, try to jam in as much of the good life as was possible. Police would stop enforcing laws. After all, what would be the point of locking up prisoners if they were never going to stand trial and go to prison? Religiously, he argued, we would see this as a cosmic betrayal. What sort of God would wipe out his greatest creation, humanity? We would lose faith in God. We would lose faith in religion. All our moral order would kind of devolve into chaos, and you would have rioting and anarchy and bloodshed. And Diefenbach argued that things would get so bad as the terror swept the planet that what would be miraculous would be if somebody survived to actually see the comet strike the Earth. So these were the two kind of points about this. And this wasn't necessarily a completely theoretical exercise, because this was in April of 1910, and in May of 1910, Halley's Comet was about to make a very close path to the Earth and was stirring up quite a bit of concern at that stage. And here it is, Halley's Comet, disturber of the peace. You are all astronomers, so I don't need to, if I'm speaking with historians, I need to explain a little bit more about comets and periods and that sort of thing. But Halley's Comet has a rough period around 75 years. So that fluctuates a little bit based upon what gravitational impulses it encounters as it passes through the solar system. But it had occurred, or it had appeared in 1835 on its previous pass. It was coming back in 1910, and most of you will remember that it made an appearance in 1986. And again, as a historian, I do tend to think a little bit about kind of the historical differences that went along with this. Think back to what life in America was like in 1835. In 1835, the Great Migration West was just beginning, so settlers were starting to head off on the Oregon Trail in Conestoga wagons, a trip that would take several months. But by 1910, railroads knit together the major cities, and you could ride across the continent on a train. In 1835, if you wanted to get somewhere quickly by land, you probably would ride a horse. In 1910, the first automobiles were going down the roads, so you had that as an option. Also in 1910, you had airplanes and dirigibles flying, so man had lifted off the ground. And of course, if you were coming over from London to the United States in 1835, you would have taken a sailing vessel. In 1910, you would be taking one of the great steamships. So there had been a huge transition in just 75 years technologically, much as there was a huge transition from 1910 to 1986. Well, because of Halley's work, we knew the comet was coming back. We knew roughly when the comet was going to be coming back, but astronomy had not advanced far enough to know exactly where in the sky the comet would appear, or really the time frame of when it would appear. And so in the summer of 1909, astronomers began to eagerly scan the skies. Everyone wanted the glory of discovering or first spotting the returning comet. Now the smart money was on this man. This is Max Wolf. He was professor of astronomy at Heidelberg University in Germany. And he was a master of astrophotography. So he had worked up techniques that allowed him to take pictures of the same quadrant of the night sky, precisely oriented night after night, so he could spot moving objects by flashing slides back and forth. He was also very gifted at long exposure photography, so he could track things that were moving a little faster or closer to the planet. And he had discovered several comets, several major asteroids, and he was always essentially picking something out of the sky. His great success occasioned a lot of jealousy, and many of his contemporaries would wish that Max would take a vacation and give somebody else a chance to discover something. But in essence, it was felt that if anybody was going to see or first spot the returning Halley's Comet, it was going to be Max Wolf. And indeed, that prediction proved to be correct. On September 12, 1909, he spotted the returning Halley's Comet, and so it was passing in front of a faint nebula, which made it even more difficult for the astronomers to spot, but not too difficult for Max Wolf. After that, and when everybody knew where to look, they were able to work out some of the coordinates and confirm and recalculate the orbit. So Frank Seagrave was an amateur astronomer and a mathematician who lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and he went through the numbers and calculated the orbit, released this to the newspapers on September 30th of 1909. According to Seagrave's math, the comet would reach perihelion, its closest pass around the sun, on April 20th of 1910, and then on May 18th of 1910, the comet head would pass 13 million miles from the Earth. Now, in astronomical terms, is that a close pass? I suppose it depends. The moon's roughly 240,000 miles away. Mars averages about 125 million miles away. So it's much further away than the moon, not quite as far away as Mars. The important thing, however, was, and this is what Seagrave announced, even though the head was going to miss the planet by 13 million miles, he predicted that the Earth would slide through the comet's tail, which again was predicted to extend around 18 million miles. So we were going to go through the comet's tail, and as we're going to see, that is going to be the source of a lot of concern. So I want to talk about 4 reasons that people were alarmed in 1910. There is still, despite Seagrave's math, the possibility of a collision. There's the possibility of a universal flood unleashed by this close pass. There's the possibility of a cosmic death ray, and this is one of my favorite ones. We'll talk about that a little later in the hour. And of course, this question of what happens to the planet when we fly through a tail, assuming that it's filled with some sort of toxic gas. I'll begin with the first one, collision. And I do want to note that all of these illustrations I'm showing you, like this one, these are just plucked right out of the newspapers of the day. So that's the comet striking the planet. This is Father Charles Charapin. Charapin was a Jesuit astronomer. He was a professor of astronomy at the University of St. Louis, and he was one of the more respected astronomers of his day. In 1909, late September 1909, he made a trip out to Tucson, or out to Arizona, excuse me. He wanted to go to the Lowell Observatory and work with Percival Lowell and look at Mars. So like many astronomers of his day, Charapin believed that Mars was inhabited and that there were aliens actively building canals and that sort of thing. And they wanted to use Lowell's very powerful telescopes, excuse me, as Mars approached Earth. So very close distance between the two of them, and they wanted to get a good look at that. Charapin headed west from St. Louis, and on his way he stopped in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Now I want to emphasize this is a very tiny town in New Mexico, not the grand city in Nevada. And while he was there as a visiting celebrity, he gave an interview to the local paper, the Daily Optic. And this was a big thing for Las Vegas, New Mexico. It was a full 2-page story as he talked about all the exciting things that were going on in astronomy and what we could expect in the heavens. In the middle of the second page, the conversation turned to the approaching Halley's Comet. So remember, Max Wolf had just spotted it, and we knew it was on its way. And he gave a couple of very important quotes here that are reprinted. And this is what the reporter wrote just in advance of those quotes. While Father Charapin has no faith in the probable catastrophe of the collision of the Earth with other planets, still he firmly believes that when Jesus predicted the destruction of the Earth by fire, he had in mind such a collision. So remember, Charapin is a Jesuit astronomer, and he believes that at some future point, the end times, the destruction of the heavens and the earth will come about, and in his idea, the destruction by a comet strike makes a lot of sense. So then we turn to the actual quote itself. So these are Father Charapin's words. If, and I've emphasized if, because this is a theoretical idea, if Halley's Comet, which is almost the size of the Earth, should strike the planet, said the priest, the impact would resolve both bodies into a great pyrotechnic display from which there would be no recovery. An event similar to that will probably be the final climax in accord with the divine plans, but I do not believe that we need to worry about that just yet, as many of the prophecies of Scripture are not yet fulfilled. I do not want to be interpreted as saying anything sensational in this line, for that is not my meaning. So, 3 points to take away. First, in 1910, astronomers don't know a lot about comets. And you can see that in just the estimation of the size of the head of the comet. So Charapin believes that it's as big as the Earth, and we know that is not the case. So there's a lot of comets that still possess a great deal of mystery for astronomers. Second, theological basis here is he does feel it's entirely consistent with the Bible that a comet or something like a comet could wipe out the Earth and inaugurate the end times. However, it's not going to happen with Halley's Comet, and the reason is the biblical prophecies that had been, came from Jesus had not yet been fulfilled, and until those had been fulfilled, nothing like this is going to happen. And so he doesn't want anybody to take what he is saying as a sensational statement and get people nervous. Well, as I said, the Daily Optic is a small paper in a small town, and if it had stayed in, that interview had stayed in that town, there probably would have been no problem. However, the Associated Press picked up the story, changed it in just a little bit of detail, and put it out on the newswire from where it ran across the country. And you see headlines like this typical one from the LA Times: "May wreck the world. Priest astronomer says Halley's Comet may fulfill Christ's prophecies." World is in great peril, right? The Olean Times Herald in New York. And stories like this run across the country. So basically what they do, the Associated Press kind of jazzes things up a little bit and turns it into the possibility that Father Charpin, who, as I said, he's a very respected astronomer, is predicting a universal catastrophe when Halley's Comet passes by in May of 1910. Now, remember, we're living in 1910, and the media landscape is not well populated yet. How do you get your news if you're living in a small town in middle America? You don't have the internet, you don't have television, you do have radio, but you don't have broadcast radio yet. There are books and magazines, but neither of them are that great for breaking news. Most of your news of the outside world comes from your local newspaper. So just imagine waking up one morning in October and unfolding your newspaper and learning that one of the country's leading astronomers is predicting that Halley's Comet is going to destroy your planet in a few months. It would be slightly unnerving. And again, the newspapers run this story and with some sort of sensational story or pictures to illustrate it. This is from the Chicago Inter-Ocean, which was a large Chicago paper and also had a Western edition, so it reached a lot of the communities west of Chicago as well. And you can see the picture on the right. I know that's a telescope looking up at the comet that's just about to strike the Earth. But if you look at, every time I look at that photo, or drawing, excuse me, I think it looks like an artillery field piece, as if the astronomers are going to take one last shot of blowing the comet out of the sky before it hits. Nevertheless, this story spread across the country and was the occasion of a great deal of alarm. The scientific community weighed in. This is Father Daniel McHugh, who was another priest astronomer. He was professor of astronomy at DePaul University. And he pushed back on two axes, his scientific objection, and that was, no, the comet is not going to strike the Earth. Frank Seagrave has worked out the math. That math has been checked extensively by the world's experts, and we know the comet head is going to clear the planet by 13 million miles, so there's not going to be a direct strike. And then he offered a theological objection as well. He is a priest after all, and quoting the words of Jesus in Mark 13, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." So while not discounting the possibility that someday in the future some object could smash into the Earth and end life as we know it, it is presumptuous of humans, any human, to speculate about when that day will come. So, because of the coordinated effort of the scientific community, the idea that the comet is going to strike the Earth is not, it's not the primary concern. So they're able to put a cap on that rather quickly. But there are other things to worry about as well. And the second idea is that if the comet makes a close pass, we would have a universal flood. And so maybe 13 million miles is in the safety zone. What brought this about? Well, on January 12, 1910, Comet A 1910 appeared in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, this was an unexpected visitor. It made a unique approach. It came up from the south and appeared finally in the north, so it was first visible in South Africa, which is where it was seen initially. There weren't many observatories in the southern hemisphere at this time, and so the comet was first spotted by 3 miners who were getting off their shift in the South African mines. They reported it to the newspaper, and eventually this story was confirmed. This was a very bright comet. It suddenly moved into the northern hemisphere, was visible in the north, and immediately people began to worry. Is this Halley's Comet? Has it suddenly made a turn and gone off course? And now is it heading right at us? Well, the scientists were able to kind of disarm that fear by saying, no, don't worry. Halley's Comet is still out there. We can see it in our telescopes. It's still far too dim for you to see with the naked eye. This is just a wonderful year in which we get two spectacular comets visiting our planet rather than one or none. So that was fine. However, on January 20th of 1910, the Seine, which flows through the center of Paris, began to rise. It rose steadily and inexorably. By January 24th, it was 25 feet above its normal level, continued to rise 1/2 inch an hour, until it reached its crest 30 feet 5 inches above the normal level. It came 1/2 inch from lapping over the levees that surround the Louvre. 1/3 of downtown Paris was underwater. As you can see here, the subway system was flooded. The sewers were flooded. And this was a record that had stood since 1615. So you never had such a catastrophic flood in recorded history in Paris. The obvious question, what caused this flood? Well, some people assumed that the comet A1910 was responsible. And this wasn't as ludicrous of a suggestion as it seems today. So Edmund Halley himself had done a lot of thinking about whether a close pass of a comet was responsible for the Genesis flood. So Noah and the Ark and that story. And his theory was that if the head of a comet came very close to the Earth, it would raise a tide, much like the moon raises a tide, and that tidal bulge would sweep the planet, and this would appear very much like a global flood event. He didn't actually come to a final conclusion about this question, but he thought it was a realistic possibility. So that was one model of how a comet could cause a flood. Again, we know that the head of a comet is far too small to cause that gravitational pull, but in 1910 they didn't know that. Henri Alexandre Delandre was the chief observer at the Meudon Observatory in France, and he had a very different model. And again, remember, we don't know exactly what the tail of a comet is, and so many astronomers believe it's gas. Delandre thought it was ionizing radiation. So he thought that somehow the comet gathered up radiation from the sun and then spat it back out the tail, and that's what a tail was. When that tail strikes the Earth, it would cause water to ionize out of the atmosphere, and you would get massive deluges and flooding across the continents. And so this is what he thought was happening with Comet A1910 and its pass. It was an interesting theory, and many people adopted it. That raises the obvious question, if Comet A1910, which was still quite a distance from the planet, had caused these terrible floods in Paris, what would happen when we flew through the tail of Halley's Comet, when we came into direct contact, right in the sites of that ionizing radiation? Well, this is Camille Flammarion. Camille Flammarion was a French astronomer, probably the most famous astronomer of his day, and we're going to talk a lot more about him in just a few minutes. Flammarion said rain caused the flood. So he had a very pragmatic response to these theories. According to Flammarion, if comets were responsible for ionizing the atmosphere, creating raindrops and causing floods, why didn't that happen everywhere that you could see the comet? Why only in Paris? So he thought the localized nature of it ruled out the idea that the comet was responsible in any way. Of course, that still left other people unconvinced, I should say. So that's the second theory of how the comet might destroy us. And if we go back to our old German school children's rhyme, you'll see that floods are certainly one of the possible things associated with the return of a comet. All right, this is the third theory, and it's, as I say, my favorite of the theories. And it gets back to this question of what is the tail of a comet? And so we simply don't know at this time, although, of course, the dominant theory is it's gas, but nobody really knows how that gas is being produced. Edwin Nolte was an amateur astronomer from New York, and he proposed an alternate theory. His theory was that a comet's head is a giant space lens. So imagine for a moment a magnifying glass, and that magnifying glass is flying through space. And as the sun's energy enters that lens, it focuses it. So if you've ever played with a magnifying glass out on a school playground or something like that, you know of the incredible power you can get just from the sun. This was Nolte's theory. So when the sun is here, the magnifying glass goes flying by, it's going to focus a beam of light behind it. And of course, the further away you get away from the sun, the less energy there is to focus, and the tail vanishes. So this was another question of why did the tail vanish on comets? People didn't understand that either. So this raises an interesting possibility. If the comet is a magnifying glass and it's going to fly between the sun and the earth, what is going to happen when that beam of concentrated energy strikes our planet? It could scorch the planet, essentially. Now, Nolte didn't believe that was going to happen. And the reason for that is he felt that this magnifying glass is made out of diffuse gases. So imagine kind of a murky, bubbling comet or magnifying glass shaped object. But because it's not ground like glass and is not capable of focusing energy as directly as glass can, you're going to get a burst of cometary energy coming from the sun, but it's not going to be enough to scorch the planet. What he thought this energy would do was alter the weather, and then you'd have geological disturbances. So he looked for an uptake of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and in mines or underground caverns where there was explosive gas, it would trigger those. So you might get subterranean explosions as well. Well, sometimes it's better to be lucky than right. Shortly after Nolte's theory was published, Mount Etna in Sicily exploded. Mount Etna is one of those volcanoes that is always going off, actually. It's not rare at all. But this was a particularly violent eruption. And so many people, and this is happening in early May, I should say, many people connect that with Nolte's theory that as this beam of energy is starting to impinge upon our planet, it's setting off geological events. Shortly after that, there was a massive earthquake in Costa Rica. Again, not an uncommon event, but it did happen coincidentally with this period. And in the middle of May, French rivers began to flood. So it appeared that Nolte's theory might have some merit. Earthquakes, also a common side effect of the appearance of a comet in the sky. But here is the one that most people worried about. So you had the strike, you had the flooding, and you had the death ray, but really it was this question of what was going to happen when we flew through the tail of the comet that was going to become the greatest disturber of the peace. And that brings us back to Camille Flammarion. Now, I call Flammarion the French Carl Sagan here. And the reason for that is he was a working astronomer in the late 19th century. He did some pioneering work on binary stars. He did a lot of work in meteorology, which was thought of as being a interlocked discipline with astronomy. And then as the 19th century came to a close and the 20th century began, Flammarion became more of a popularizer of astronomy. So he wrote a number of books about astronomy, explaining to a lay audience what was going on up in space? What were the newest discoveries astronomers were making? What did we know about how our solar system worked? He also wrote hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper and magazine articles. So by the time 1910 comes around, he is probably the most famous astronomer on the planet. And in that, he is a parallel of Carl Sagan, who also had a distinguished career, but really became most famous for the books he wrote, like Cosmos and his appearances on television. If you had asked somebody in 1910 to name an astronomer, 9 out of 10 probably would have mentioned Camille Flammarion. Today, if you ask somebody to name an early 20th century astronomer, it would be rare to find 1 person out of 10 who would name Camille Flammarion. And the reason for that is that the comet is going to destroy Flammarion's reputation. So he's going to go down in infamy. Comet in the media. So in November of 1909, November 30th, in fact, Flammarion published an article in the New York Herald. And this was essentially an update on what Halley's Comet was doing. So we knew Halley's Comet was on the way, and month by month, Flammarion is publishing updates. Where is the comet? When can we expect to see it? What's it doing right now? That sort of thing. At the end of his article, Flammarion wrote 3 problematic paragraphs. So he closed out his article with three statements. And I want to read those statements to you. So here was the first of 3 paragraphs. From the mechanical, physical, chemical, and thermodynamic viewpoints, we may at once acknowledge that we know nothing of the fate reserved for us next May. The poisoning of humanity by deleterious gases is improbable. Now, I don't know how you feel about that word, improbable. If I'm a reader living in 1910, improbable is not the word I want to read. I want impossible. The idea that it simply cannot happen. I'm not exactly sure why Flammarion chose this word to end this sentence, but my theory is it was just out of proper scientific humility. A scientist knows that any theory he holds to be true today could be confuted tomorrow by new evidence. So we always have to be ready to accept the new and discard old or theories that no longer stand the test of time or experience. And so it's very dangerous to say impossible, to speak in black and white terms. Far better to speak improbable, to say improbable. So it's very unlikely to happen. As we're going to see, Flammarion doesn't believe for a moment it's going to happen. But we'll get onto that here. He then, and this is where he gets into trouble, he does this little thought experiment. Doubtless, if the oxygen of the atmosphere combined with the hydrogen of the comet's tail, it would mean universal death with short shrift. If, on the contrary, there resulted a diminution in the supply of nitrogen, the brain of every one of us would experience an unexpected sensation of physical activity, and the human race would come to an end in a paroxysm of joy, universal delirium and madness at bottom, probably overjoyed at its fate. Carbonic oxide, on the contrary, would cause universal poisoning of the lungs. So again, I've highlighted these ifs. This is just a thought experiment. If this was to happen, then this would be what you could expect. However, it's not going to happen. And we know that because he wrote a final paragraph in this story. Anxious minds have, however, no reason to be tormented, uselessly too, by these prognostications. Comet tails, it is true, are immense, but they are so light, so rarefied, that the terrestrial atmosphere is like lead in comparison. Even were our globe completely plunged into such a tail, we would, without doubt, be saved from a cataclysm by the atmospheric curtain which surrounds us. The comet might be compared to a fog through which a locomotive was dashing at full speed. And the article ends at this point. Which of these 3 paragraphs would you expect the nation's newspapers to pick up and run with? If you chose the middle paragraph, you are right. So the first reaction to this came in the British press. They were a little bit ahead of the United States. The Manchester Guardian, Monsieur Camille Flammarion, who's been foretelling in the Paris edition of the New York Herald the dreadful things that may happen. The Liverpool Daily Post, Flammarion frankly declares he cannot foretell the results of such a situation. The Nottingham Post, when we pass through the comet's tail, partial destruction of humanity possible. So again, remember, this is not what Flammarion wrote. Nevertheless, these are the stories that are going to start circulating. In December, the Washington Post ran a story. This is a very odd story in that you really have to know what Flammarion had said to get the joke. But essentially what the writer is talking about is that the Greenwich Observatory, the scientists, the astronomers were so excited. They were getting great first looks at Halley's Comet. They were jumping around, and the writer wonders if this is one of the first paroxysms of joy that Flammarion had speculated about. So these were a bit elusive. However, things became much clearer beginning in January. LA Times, world ends in March approximately. Flammarion prophecy works havoc with the ignorant. Many Europeans take it as gospel truth. Peasants are prodigal, farmers refuse to sow. The Oakland Tribune, earth calamity prophesied. And of course, this is just going to go on and on. For the next several months, until we reach May itself, newspaper after newspaper is going to assert that Flammarion, the most famous astronomer on the planet, is prophesying the death of us all in May. Now, Flammarion, when he hears that this is what is happening, he tries to fight back. In February, he published an article. I would like, first of all, to warn the French and foreign journalists against a temptation to which they've already yielded, that of accusing me of announcing the end of the world for May 19th next. The end of the world will not occur on May 19th next. If you're confused about the dates, I've said that Halley's Comets, or we're going to pass into the tail on May 18th. That's New York time. And so we will pass into the tail early in the morning of May 19th in Europe and England. So he's going to spend, these last months running up to the passage of, or the approach of the comet, trying to correct the record, but it does no good. Newspaper after newspaper will continue to assert that Camille Flammarion is predicting our doom. That fear is amplified to a certain extent on February 7th of 1910, when astronomers at the Yerkes Observatory announced the presence of cyanogen gas in the comet's tail. So they're doing spectrography, trying to figure out what are the constituent component parts of the tail, and they discover cyanogen. Now, cyanogen, for those of you who are not chemists, is a very close relative of cyanide. It's extremely toxic, used in pesticides, and if you have a flask of it, it's a light blue color, so a very pleasing color, and it's said to smell like almonds. So if you suddenly smell almonds and you don't have a handful of nuts, be concerned, because you might be breathing in cyanogen gas. Nevertheless, it is a deadly toxin. Professor Edwin Booth of the University of California, Berkeley, waded in once that result was announced. If the astronomers are right in their estimations of the amount of cyanogen gas in the tail of Halley's Comet, and if that body's vapors do envelope the Earth, we may have a chance to fill the sensation of the bugs and insects which are killed by the use of this deadly gas as an exterminator. Isn't that cheerful news? Well, the newspapers, essentially in the half year running up to the advent of Halley's Comet, are going to run horror story after horror story. Their typical model is they will misattribute Camille Flammarion or some other astronomer and say the end is nigh, and then have a kind of a counterpoint article with responsible astronomers who confute that idea. But you might wonder, why would newspapers misrepresent these men? What would be in it for them? And this brings us back to how the media works, both then and arguably now. Upton Sinclair was a journalist He wrote a number of exposés. His most famous was of the Chicago meat packing industry called The Jungle. But in 1910, he turned his attention on his own industry and wrote a book called The Brass Check. So this was a critique of journalism as practiced in the United States. And he identified, well, his problem with it is newspapers are for-profit organizations. So he called this corporate journalism. And so there was a financial incentive to misrepresent the truth, to go for a sensationalist coverage of stories, to make every story seem much bigger, more dangerous than it actually was. And this makes sense. How do you get readers to your newspaper? How do you get people to watch your television shows in the modern world? You don't do it by covering boring stories. You do it by covering the stories that are going to scare people to death or outrage people. And so he identified what he called the three pernicious practices: misrepresenting the words and ideas of subjects, so claiming that Flammarion had said we were going to be wiped out would be an example of that. Fabricating stories, and so there are many examples, and I have these in the book, Comet Madness, of newspapers simply making up stories, just complete fiction, and exaggerating the importance of stories. So at its heart, the passage of Halley's Comet was an interesting science story. It shouldn't have been page one, a page one story, especially in the last week before the comet struck. Theodore Roosevelt was no fan of a lot of journalism of his day, and he said, yellow journalism deifies the cult of the mendacious, the sensational, and the inane, and throughout its wide but vapid field does as much to vulgarize and degrade the popular taste, to weaken the popular character, and to dull the edge of the popular conscience as any influence under which the country can suffer. These men sneer at the very idea of paying heed to the dictates of a sound morality. As one of their number has cynically put it, they are concerned merely with selling the public whatever the public will buy. So the story that gets the most attention, the story that gets the most clicks, that's the story we run. And we do it so we can sell advertising, basically. So some things haven't changed. These four doomsday scenarios received extensive coverage, especially as we entered into May, increased publisher profits, but produced what we would call some probably predictable outcomes. Did we react with a Socratic calm? I would say that the majority of Americans probably were believing what the astronomers said, and that we were in no danger, but there were, of course, exceptions to that. And so I want to kind of talk about a few of the defensive measures that people adopted. The most innovative one, I thought, was the Berkeley submarine. So in April of 1910, newspapers reported that 3 men in Berkeley were building a submarine, and they based this on Captain Nemo's fabulous voyage under the sea. And their idea was to build a submarine large enough that they could put themselves and their families aboard, and then when the comet's tail was about to impinge upon our atmosphere, they would submerge, go down 20 or 30 feet, spend 3 or 4 days down there until the comet gases work their way out of the atmosphere, come back up, and repopulate the Earth. There were some practical considerations, of course, one of which was they proposed this project in April, and the comet was going to arrive on May 18th, and so that's not a lot of time to build a fully functioning submarine. I would argue no shipyard in the modern age could do that in 45 days. But the other thing they encountered is when the news broke they were doing this, they were besieged with applicants. People desperately wanted to get a seat aboard the submarine and would do practically anything to assure that. And so ultimately they were turning away so many people and angering so many people, they just abandoned the effort. Far more practical was the construction of gas fallout shelters. So we receive all sorts of reports of this happening across the country. John Marlowe, a farmer from Council Bluffs, Iowa, was digging an underground shelter that would be large enough to shield his family, 2 horses, 2 cows, a dog, a cat, and a number of chickens. So he was preparing to to ride out the storm underground. The antisocial version of this, Stephen Harder of Pasadena, California, was doing the same, but his fallout shelter was only going to be large enough for one person and a shelf of canned goods. And his rationale was he didn't want anybody else in his fallout shelter. His hope was that everybody would be gassed, and then once that had passed, he could come up and enjoy the planet Earth by himself without other people to bother him. So kind of an interesting approach there. When a great fear is spreading or panic is spreading, the con men are there to take advantage of that. And so we have a number of cases of people selling gas masks or gas filters. In Houston, Texas, 3 men were arrested by the police for selling gas masks, which when they disassembled them, they found that the filter units were just packed straw. So that probably wasn't going to work very well. You had in Haiti, a very famous witch doctor had said that he had come up with an anti-cyanogen pill. And so if you took 2 of his pills every day, morning and night, you would just come right through the storm and have no trouble whatsoever. And so he was doing, by all reports, a huge business. The lines were stretching down the block of people buying his pills. And then, this is the one I think I probably would have adopted if I had been in this situation. New York saloon keepers made the discovery that alcohol denatured cyanogen gas. So their idea was, go to your local bar, have the barman pour out a line of tumblers of scotch, and then sit there and simply sip the night away, keeping kind of a constant stream going down your throat. And this would make sure that you wouldn't have any problems with this. There were, of course, in this time of heightened or growing panic, predictable tragedies. So there were cases of temporary insanity. A farmer named Fred Bowers of Orrville, Ohio, in early May announced that he wasn't going to pay his creditors. So he had significant debts with the businesses around town. He said, why should I give my money to them? I'm just going to take it and use it myself and enjoy these final 2 weeks. Live it up, essentially. His creditors were unhappy with that solution, of course, and they engaged the police, and Fred was arrested and hauled off to prison. He railed in the jail cell that we're all going to die, the comet's going to kill us all, and created such a ruckus that a psychiatrist was brought in to evaluate him, and he determined that Fred was in a state of temporary insanity, and he was remanded to the state mental institution in Ohio. Kind of an odder story came out of New Jersey, and on the morning of May 18th, with the comet just about with us just about to enter the comet's tail, Luigi Chiaffici went into his local police station and confessed to a murder. Luigi Chiaffici was a member of the Italian Black Hand, which was kind of an offshoot of the mafia. And he told the police that he had killed a man named Patrick Cahill, and Cahill had just gone missing. It had been a perfect crime. Nobody knew. Cahill himself was kind of a loner. He was unmarried, and he had just vanished one day. And people thought, oh, he must have just moved to some other town. Nobody was concerned. Days had passed. The police weren't looking for him. It was the perfect crime. But Chiaffici said, no, I killed him, and I buried him beside my pig pen. And in fact, he then took the police to the pig pen. They dug up the body, and sure enough, there was Patrick Cahill. The police said, why did you confess? You would have gotten away with this. And Chiaffici said, I know that tonight we're all going to be killed in this comet's tail, and I couldn't go and stand before my maker with this horrible crime upon my conscience. So he confessed to this crime, comet responsible for solving a crime. And then, as you would expect, there were quite a few suicides across the country and indeed around the world. One of the earliest suicides I was able to find in America was a young woman named Ruby Woolfield, who lived in Yakima, Washington. She and her husband lived on the banks of the Yakima River. She had just had a baby a few months earlier, and one morning she told her husband, "Watch out for watch the baby. I'm going to go out and check the mail." And so she went out. She was gone for about an hour, and eventually her husband realized, that seems a little odd. She's been gone quite a while, and he went out to look for her and saw her standing down on the banks of the river. He looked away, and then he looked back, and she was gone. He ran down to the river, and she had thrown herself into the river and had drowned in a whirlpool. Her friends and neighbors said that she was inordinately obsessed with the comet and was deathly afraid that she was going to die, kind of a horrific death, choking in the comet gases. This was in no sense an exception. So there were many people who killed themselves or tried to kill themselves to avoid this. So I would classify suicide as a dire thing in this case, and I think we can add that to the list. Well, this is one of those lectures where you kind of already know the ending. So the Earth passed through the comet's tail on May 18th of 1910, and much to the disappointment of newspapers who had to write, "Nothing happened." Well, nothing happened, in fact. We all survived our passage through the tail. Kind of a happy ending to the story. It did not harm the planet. Okay, I think that brings me to the end of tonight's presentation. If you're interested in this story, I've really only touched on a small tip of the iceberg. There's quite a bit more to the story, but that's can be found in Comet Madness. And if you're interested in other stories, my newest book is L.A. Birdman, which is about California contributions to the history of aviation. So if you labor under the misconception that it was all about Wilbur and Orville Wright here in America, that's also a nice book to take a look at. Other than that, I think I'm finished, and if we have any questions, we could certainly take a few of those.
Yes.
Thanks for a fascinating talk, and after hearing it, I decided that if I ever start a garage band, it's going to be called Cosmic But your interesting correlation, I don't know if you've discovered this, between the number of astronomers and Catholic priests. It's true today, right? Detroit's own brother guy, Consolmagno, head of the Vatican Observatory, George Lemaitre, key figure in understanding the expansion of the universe. Is there something there, or is that just sort of a selection bias? Like, if you're a newspaper writer and you don't know anything about astronomy, you turns out some sort of, famous person like that by university or something.
No, I would think that over this whole entire scientific age, religious figures and pastors and priests have made a huge contribution to science. And I don't think it's extra. I think science has become so specialized now that it's really difficult for somebody to be both a professional astronomer and a priest. So I think the age of the amateur contribution from religious figures has probably passed for the most part. I mean, there obviously are still some, but no, I don't think it's a selection bias at all.
Yes.
You said that one French astronomer's career was ruined.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly happened to him?
Yes. So what happens on May 19th is the big question. When nothing happens, the newspapers are going to pillory Camille Flammarion for leading the world astray. And so he evidently increased terror to a boiling point, and then nothing happened. And so his reputation is going to be locked into this idea that he had predicted that the comet would destroy humanity. And as I showed you quite clearly, that was not his belief, but you can't overcome the press. And that is so true. I talked about Carl Sagan a little earlier. Carl Sagan wrote a book called Comet, when 1986, when Halley's Comet returned. And if you go and you look in that, even Carl Sagan says Camille Flammarion predicted the end of humanity and created great terror in 1910, and it's simply not true. But Flammarion, yes, this is a huge blow to his reputation, and my theory is that is why he's not more famous than he is.
More questions? So I don't see any in the room. I am going to see if I can see the Zoom audience here. And see if we have any questions from that. Anybody out there Zoom? Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah, from John Walton. That's actually interesting. We, club member, it's been around for long. We don't see him much anymore. Mark Depressed. He actually used to run an experiment and prove that. We run an open house. He's got his telescope set up. If one person came up and was looking at something, he would make something up about what they were looking at that was really stupid. And usually that person, if it was profoundly stupid enough, will kind of, really? Oh, come on. Or make some remark like that. But if he got 3 or 4 people there, he could say exactly the same thing and nobody said it.
So I actually do have a question. At the beginning, where you talked about coffee and Diefenbach, I could not find any information on coffee at all with a quick Google search. Diefenbach was apparently a Unitarian, but what was coffee's religious affiliation?
He was a Protestant minister. I can't recall what his denomination was, though. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I could not find any information on him at all. I was trying.
Okay. See no other questions? How about a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Excellent and entertaining talk, Richard. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Getting up early in the morning for us, too. Well, we're wondering, since it's early morning for you, could you tell us who won the basketball games that are coming up?
Yeah, I absolutely can. Your pools are wrong, I'm sad to say. Big upsets.
Oh, they're okay.
Taking bets.
Yeah. Okay, also, do I see our treasurer, Doug Stoll?
He said he wasn't gonna make it.
Okay,
Charlie, I've got you.
okay, so, if you could send us some information, Richard, on how to get you the fee for your talk. You are,
I can do.
by the way.
Okay, I can do that.
We might include something extra, too.
Okay, thank you.
Just to say thanks, so, okay, again, appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to be here.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
I have one comment.
Go ahead.
My paternal grandfather was alive, would have been 13 in 1910. And he just talked about seeing it up in the sky. I thought it was great.
Wow.
But I never knew if he was talking about Comet Halley or the Great Comet of 1910. Now, considering that the Great Comet of 1910 came around in January,
Yeah.
what were the chances that anybody saw it in Michigan, or he was in Springfield, Illinois? So, you know, how many people saw comets this January? How many people saw anything but clouds? But I have read many places that comet was actually brighter than Halley, and that's what a lot of people from back then confused their memories. But he told me that, he said, yeah, I saw it up there, it was great. But he never said anything about people panicking.
Wow. Well, he didn't mind the height then. It seems like he couldn't have missed it. That was.
Oh,
paper, yeah,
It's either.
right,
Clear.
yeah. No, I mean, all the hype about the stories and all that, so,
Right,
yeah.
right. And he was old enough, so.
Right, right.
Sure. So
Oh, yes.
the banner image that you come in to outside, that central comment image, I believe is a photo of Halley's Comet from 1910 through the fence.
Oh, wow, how cool.
I should remember the photographer's name, starts with Robert. I don't think it's Robert Curtis. That's archived at the Bentley as a transparency. You don't have the photo.
Kind of along that line, you sold that picture,
Did you bring that in, Dave? What, this was of the.
Yes.
yeah,
This was the sun.
but still. This is, these, I've mentioned a couple times that the McMahon telescope that we love so much, was actually originally used to make. In fact, it was the first telescope that ever made videos of the sun. But Dave actually has some of the stills that were taken from the McMahon telescope. This was before it was moved over to Beach Mountain. And so by Pontiac, so I think, so. I know that one, I think it's the bottom left, if you look at that, just right, it almost looks 3D. It's interesting. Yeah, that was, what made our scope kind of famous, you know, people don't know. Let's see. I have a few things here. One of them is discussing the Messier Marathon dates, and we were gonna do that, but I think somebody else is gonna bring that up, so I'm gonna defer on that one. Just to remind everybody, we have the elections, office elections coming up next month. I have not told everybody to see who wants to run again yet. I haven't heard anybody say they're packing for the woods yet either. I probably will run again, but I'm also having one of those years where I'm starting to think that maybe I'm tired of it. I do that every once in a while. I burn out and I get a second wind and do it again. So, but somebody's got to do it. Anyway, but we'll be working on that. But consider that nominations are open, actually starting as of now, and up until the actual meeting next month. Let's see here. Oh, I did mention that we had a request to reschedule the Westland Library event that we attempted to do last October. And I've been working with Aubrey there, and we have, Aubrey here. Anyway, we have just settled as of earlier today on June 6th. That's actually a Friday night. That works out better for them because they've got staff people probably don't want to come in Saturday, I would assume. Thing there is gonna be, it starts pretty late in early June there, she's aware of that, so anyway, I'll send out more stuff and start recruiting help for that unless you wanna give yourselves up for it right now, write your name down. But I'll start gathering help on that one. And also, I got earlier this week, like last week, another package of stuff from the Night Sky Network, which is, as I recall, correct, as I don't recall, they are, oh, this little thing celebrating the moon. So, you know what I'm thinking? Since the theme of this is the moon, maybe this would be a good little handout for our moon and Mars thing that we're gonna talk about tonight too. I was thinking maybe Tecumseh or something, but this might be more appropriate for our moon night, since it's about the moon. And I think these are the same thing, they just packaged it separately now. Okay. We can hold for that. I think that is all I have.
We're gonna discuss the moon and Mars.
I think one of the other officers is gonna bring that up. In fact, I believe Ryan. It's in the Zoom audience.
Yeah.
He dropped.
Was it?
Was it?
So hold on. There it is. There it is. Oh, okay.
Ryan. Can you hear us?
Not well. The microphones there are perpetually poor, so I had trouble hearing.
Okay. So talk loud.
We're talking about.
You're up.
About tomorrow night?
Yes.
Well, I hope to carry on the tradition of our beloved John Cosland, and I'll be hosting the Messier Marathon at my house here in Saline. Check your email. I gave the address, but I can put it in the chat right now. And it's going to be brutally cold, but it's going to be clear. So I will provide a place to warm up and snacks and warm drinks and all the comforts necessary to stay warm. My house is no darker than peach, but we have bathroom and warmth. So I'll be getting going by 9 o'clock. So if you can RSVP, that'd be helpful. I'll know what to prepare for. Any questions?
How many people do you have now?
I have one RSVP, Don Foey.
Yeah, me.
Make that 2.
And
Forrester, I'm coming.
That's
Okay.
3.
all right, great. And Adrian said he would come, but Adrian says yes to just about everything.
Ooh, Brian, I heard.
I can I could not hear. I could not hear what was just said.
Just
Yeah, he's in. So you got Don, Adrian, Jim. So far.
Oh.
Maybe Alex, I think, will come.
Okay,
Maybe Alex. Okay, so we got 3.5.
there you go.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I will. I'll put it in the chat. Check your email. Send me an email. But I was thinking that for folks who don't come, we could do a lowbrow imaging Messier marathon. And so I downloaded a poster, a blank poster of the grid of all the 110, right? And we can copy and paste in our pictures that we take. So after the fact, I'll ask people who've taken pictures of it, if we need that one, we'll paste it in. I got a feeling that we're really going to be desperate for those objects that you can't see until after 4 o'clock, okay? Because I might be in bed by then. And the moon comes up at 4:30, okay? And it's a pretty big moon. So it might be really hard to get those summer Milky Way objects, right? The stuff in Sagittarius and Scorpius, I think, is going to be tough. But I'll be looking for those. We probably won't get those. Any other questions?
Just one point, we did have email discussion about this, and that was Peach Mountain, Lake Hudson. People were kind of back and forth, and then Brian threw this in, and that seemed to be pretty popular. So I don't know, does anybody want to go to Peach Mountain or Lake Hudson? Or not, I mean, I guess you can. If it's
We can go to
Peach Mountain, somebody's got to let you in.
Or we can go to his house and be warm.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
We're sitting.
Yeah, I think you got the venue, Brian.
Well, I wish it was going to be warmer, but we will stay comfortable. I got the red lights all ready to go. I've got red lights, and I've got it. Yeah. So, and I think I even have dug up some old hand heaters. You know, those little those glove heaters. You know, and toe heaters. I found some of those. So we'll do our best to stay warm.
Did you want to bring up the Moon and Mars night subject, Brian?
Yeah,
She's not here, so she just kind of laid it with us and
Yeah,
let us
she.
know what we came up with.
Yeah, she did send me some stuff that we can discuss. So we have 2 moon nights that we have just talked about. They're about a month apart, and they're both on Saturday nights. We looked at Saturday, April 5th, And we also have been talking about the return to the moon, which we did last year. That's on Saturday, May 3rd. So April 5th, May 3rd, about a month apart, 2 moon nights. And I don't know if we have decided on locations for those two.
I think originally we had talked about the AADL, but then you had pointed out the low viewing angle that we're gonna have.
Charlie, I think the return to the moon worldwide event is in June. And
Oh,
that's the one where the moon is.
Oh, yeah, okay, you're right, yeah.
you're right. So
But the
sorry.
April and May dates, the moon's high in the sky.
Yeah,
And so
right.
the downtown library worked really well.
Okay.
You're right. Yep, the return to the moon is June 7th. So we're talking about early May Saturday, early June, early April, early May, and early June Saturdays. Very true.
Not June 6th.
Yeah, it's June 6th. Well, they allow you to do it anytime throughout the weekend, you know, Friday, Saturday. But I guess we should focus on the April 5th one first.
Yeah, yeah.
Where should that be?
I would say AADL, like we did last time. For the other moons, yeah.
Subject to weather.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I'm just saying for May, I don't see that we have a better place for sidewalk astronomy than the library.
Yeah, I would say, I think we should do both of them. I think that was the original idea.
Yeah, it has a lot of traffic. If our goal is to reach the public, that's a good spot.
Yeah, yeah.
But then in June, the moon's too low for that location.
Yes.
That's
So we have to come up with something for that.
That's the bottom line. Yep, it looks like the moon will be in the trees just south of the library.
It's not a question of we have enough commitment from members.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we really hadn't scheduled the June one.
Well, not the June, I was talking about 4/5. The 4/5 and 5/3, right? Those are the 2 dates.
Yeah, yeah.
Commitment from members for those two to be able to get back to AADL and say yes or no.
Yes, I think I can go ahead and let Amy know. Yeah, yes, I'm hopeful.
We gotta get going on the April one.
June is a work in progress.
Right, that's a little further off.
Yeah.
But 4 and 5, we gotta let them know.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, it's April 5th and May 3rd.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what,
okay. That's what I didn't hear.
April and May.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Okay. Now, Amy did look into other places with better horizons for the June 7th moon event, and she looked into the Pittsfield branch of the library, which we've had a positive event at previously, but they have big nasty lights that cannot be turned off.
Yeah.
So she doesn't like that. So she did offer that they have more of a warehouse operation on the west side off of Jackson Road. It's the plaza. And that's an option as well. I mean, it's more of a warehouse, and it is bigger with lots of parking. She just puts that out there as that it is a possibility.
But much less foot traffic.
Yeah.
Both of those are the
Way
way.
less.
0 foot traffic, other than maybe the occasional raccoon.
Right. Well, the raccoons might want to see the moon too.
I like that comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, a number of years ago, we had, not us, but the library had a solar system viewing event at the Pittsfield branch. And it was pretty successful.
Yes,
Probably
that's
100 people. And
yes.
for bright objects, it's just fine out there. If you're trying to show people galaxies, it's a total disaster, but you know, it might work, right? If we're showing them the moon, be able to see the moon from there.
Yep,
Thought
you're right.
Saturn there pretty easily despite all the lights.
Yeah,
Telescopes snaking around parking with lines snaking around.
So why don't we just go with Amy's preference?
Pittsfield.
Yeah, what she wants to do. Maybe she wants to do one,
Yeah,
one, the other one.
Right, see what she's on.
Yeah.
Offer April and May, and then for June, and downtown. And then for, June, Pittsfield.
Oh, yeah, for the on the moon thing.
Since we have enough.
Burned out on the moon.
Right, if we have enough.
Yeah, yeah. All right.
Pittsfield one.
Anything else, Brian?
Yeah, that's it. I think one other consideration to think about is when we do the sidewalk things, it's kind of like a pop-up event, right? We're out there, and yes, it's good to have some promotions, but we do rely on foot traffic, and so yeah, so a lot of advertising is not required if we're going to a place that has a lot of foot traffic.
It's supposed to be sidewalk astronomy. Almost seems wrong to advertise it. Okay. Yeah.
I have never,
That's quick. Well, it seems like you did want to bring something up.
well,
And,
I was promoting the Mississippi Marathon.
that's what it was, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last month, I forgot the date, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, I did an impromptu event at Independence Park, that was very successful. Very successful.
It was great. Fabulous views of Mercury, like you've never seen.
What day was that?
Sunday.
Sunday.
Two Sunday.
What was the Sunday, was it?
Yeah, I think.
Sunday night, yeah.
Two Sundays.
Planets and everything like that, Mercury.
Right, you said, you mean another
Place in Canada.
Yeah,
that's
great
great.
location.
I spent a lot of time there.
Yeah. Very low.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We looked at trapeze.
Hey, Ken.
I tried to contact Professor at U of M about speaking and still have not heard back from them. So I'm not sure if I'm just asking you all. My contact was someone Doug Warshaw's. So we'll have to see. I'll talk to the officers about that, see what I'm doing involved in taking the request. And hopefully we'll be able to line up another. Oh, and I also have, so I personally, other than that, I have on the report. However, Doug Scoble apologizes for not being here, but says that he is willing to serve for another year as treasurer. And he does have a report, the treasurer's report. We have 213 members. He made the usual payment for the AT&T hotline, T-shirt for February guest speaker, Jeff McLeod, and reimbursed Jeff $34 for the cost of our annual web host. And April 1st, there will be a detailed end of year report. It will be going out in the newsletter, most likely. Amy had something. Didn't she?
I think
Here.
Yeah, you have her again? I think she was just asking about the, audits.
Yeah, I think it was just
Let's make sure.
it was the two items, the planning for ADL. No, you had the more recent report from me.
Right.
So we're selling.
All right. And I think I see one more, Jack.
Okay. Just have two things of interest. One, I was contacted by a representative from U of M, the telecom installation project manager. U of M is looking at installing an internet network connection in Litchfield Woods. They asked me about Peach Mountain Observatory. Something about 4 years ago, in 2020, they started doing it, looked at the cost and everything, decided not to do it. But they're going at it again about bringing an internet connection out there for radio observatory and the other facilities out there for the College of Engineering. And they'd ask us connection in the building or outside the building, things like that. I'm not sure. Well, the last time that we were looking at it, we looked at internet, the fiber optic cable was brought in. I'm not sure what they're gonna do, if they're gonna try to do that again, or if they're like some kind of antenna or something up there, I just don't know. The other thing is, the Ford Astronomy Conference swap meet is April the 5th. I've got a table there with a couple items from the observatory we're gonna sell. One of our club members, Mike Hayden, has got some stuff he's going to sell up there. And what we're looking at is, see how this may work out, because maybe next year they have swap meet if there's some other equipment you want to sell at the observatory, or some club members that may want to sell some of their equipment. Maybe we could work together, run a table, and everybody could just come out and sell their equipment. Next year. Next year, yeah. Next, that would be, this is 25 to 26. See how this works out this year. Take it from there. We're gonna see what costs. The table's not, I think, wait a minute. The table was $20 in advance, 25 at the door if available. And when you have a table, you get one admission ticket is included. So that's how that works. I already set in for advanced registration and everything. And 2026? Or for 2025, this week. April the 5th, Saturday. Also, one of our club members, Clay Kessler, is giving a talk on telescope making. And Adrian Bradley is giving astronomy and tree pictures talk. So, yeah, I've got nothing to do. Come on out there on Saturday, April 5th.
Public Tech is also the moon night.
Yeah. It's gonna be, to say, it'll be very good.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, a bunch of questions. I mean, questions that I can't answer.
and that is the extent of my report on the observatory. And I did go out there and check again. The heaters are working and everything, so far things are going good out there. Other than that, it's all outside the city.
Does anybody have anything else, either in the room or by Zoom? Jim?
Registration is open for the Okie Tech Star Party at the latter part of September. Just type in Okie Techs into the search and you'll come to their website. You can sign up online. It's about 1,300 miles from Ann Arbor, and it's about the darkest place you'll ever observe.
If you wanna see it, see me, I got pictures.
And
That's
I signed up, I registered just before I came up here tonight. So
What's the date?
if you've got any questions, it's 15th to the 27th, something like that. September.
Yeah, it's all September this year.
So we might get some diagonal light and
Yeah, we usually do. We get the zodiacal light going by Orion. Sometimes we get, so here, when the moon's bright, you don't really see the galaxy at all. You can tell it's a dark sky, we can see the Milky Way going right through the thin crescent moon and still see the Milky Way clear. How dark it is out here. So, you can come out, we recommend at least once, go out there and see what it's like under those dark skies. Even when it's not transparent, it's like it was last year. It wasn't very transparent, but it was still impressive.
Anything else? Anybody else there in the cyber world? Okay.
You know what, AstroCon, our own Brian Autumn is giving a presentation at AstroCon in June on astrophotography. We're all gonna be at Bryce Canyon. And so he's gonna be leading he's gonna be kind of leading an astrophotography class out there. I'll be a hidden figure, sort of running around helping and doing things. I'll be driving out myself. It's middle of June, so it's after that early June date.
That's
June. Yeah,
That's
we're
a
gonna
good
go.
Bryce Canyon.
Bryce Canyon,
Utah.
Utah. Yeah, so we'll be out there, Brian. You'll have to repeat it for Brian. He can't hear me, but
I got it.
oh, you got it. Okay. Yep. So we'll be out there at Bryce Canyon wearing Lowbrow shirts, and he'll be doing most of the talking, and I'll butt in all the time and show off the magazines I've been published in. I just heard I have a third one coming around the June 2025 issue. Will have my confession that I hate chasing Aurora. And there will be pictures of them. Brian knows every time the 2 or 3 times we've gotten together, we've managed to hit a beautiful Aurora display. And we've watched it change people from being bored and sleepy to absolutely fascinating. The colors become very vivid, you can see it all. We lucked out and saw, I think, 3 of the 4 that hit. We were in the same place when it happened. There are some pictures of some of that Aurora in this article. So I've got more writing to do. They won't publish them if I don't write them, so send me ideas. I have a couple that I'm playing around with as well to write, so Lowbrows in space. We're out there evangelizing and doing our thing, wearing our shirts.
Cool. Do you want to say something about that, Austin? I just don't set that up.
In the side of the room, just kind of considering the content of tonight's presentation, I brought out a few of our Donati comic sketches from 1858. They were donated by Francis Steinen in 2007, shortly before his death. And he was the U of M alum. He was the director of the Warner Schwazy Observatory at Case Western, and then donated these to the Detroit Observatory. 7. So we have a few views of Comet Donati from the Harvard College Observatory as sketched. What I'm going to go grab in a minute and bring down is our second director, James Watson's A Treatise on Comets, which talks about a lot of the things that the speaker talked about with respect to like what people thought about comets, and it's sort of like a layperson's book, sort of debunking those. What they thought comets were made of and how they were being observed back in 1858, particular highlight one of those. I'll have that out over here and I'll complete it in just a second.
Was Watson the one who thought that this was too far out of town?
That was the university president, Henry Tappan.
Oh,
Tappan did not want the observatory here. He wanted it on the dian, but it's probably in our.
Yeah.
So the street creatures.
For about 20 years, they hated Tappan. And then when Angel came along, they kind of turned around on him, and that's when they started naming buildings, the streets, the schools. Full circle.
Anybody have anything else?
That's the same telescope or type of telescope that David Levy donated to the museum in Kansas City. One of his first telescopes that he used to observe. I recognize a lot like that.
Good old 4-inch refractor.
He donated one of his first 4-inch refractors to this museum, as well as his observations on Shoemaker Levy 9. He gave them I think the Leslie Library. It's in Kansas City, and I owe you guys looking it up to get the actual name. This telescope was there, through it. Saw nothing, but it was still cool to look through. And he gave a talk there at the library, part of AstroCon last year. We got to see the library, see some old writings. I don't think the books of Galileo came out, but there were some others that astronomy books that were temporary. We had a chance to see, couldn't touch it more, you get thrown out of the library. You had to have gloves, turn the pages especially. I ripped one of the pages out.
You just want to let it go.
No, I just went back and drank Coca-Cola because they had snacks. I'm only coming over there for the snacks, Brian. Stars and Nebula, that's fine, but snacks are.
Yeah, he didn't announce what he had for food, did he?
Bring your own bag.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Does anybody have anything else?
Pizza House, who's going?
Does that mean a motion to adjourn?
Motion to observe, adjourn.
If that's a support, all in favor?
Aye.